This is the Miller Philosopher. When the Lord of the Rings trilogy first came out back in 2001, it had become legendary in a very short amount of time, itself massively expanding an already loyal fandom and igniting new interest in Tolkien's world in both literature and media. So that includes games and even further books that have come out since then, like The Children of Hurin and The Fall of Numenor. Many had tried since to follow the same path to success, or even if they dare try to take the throne, but none had succeeded. That was at least until Game of Thrones arrived on the scene in 2011. It was hailed by many as the new Lord of the Rings, which came out at this point 10 years prior. Of course, there's a difference between a cinematic experience and watching from home experience, and in that at least, Lord of the Rings remained unchallenged. But since there was no Lord of the Rings TV shows at that time, someone apparently had figured out that rather than try to take Tolkien's cinematic throne, that instead they would pull a Saruman, if you will, and set up a rival throne beside it, the Two Tower scenario, if you will. Famously now, it wanted to do a more realistic take on medieval fantasy stories, not just a copy of Lord of the Rings beat for beat, as others have tried to do. George R.R. Martin's now famous quote of "What was Aragorn's taxation policies?" you can pull up anywhere online. And he has also famously said that the death of Boromir was his favorite from his senpai, I guess you can say, because it had stakes and he did not come back, unlike other characters like Gandalf. Now, of course, Boromir wasn't the only main character to die in the books, but it does emphasize the point of how Tolkien's works can be perceived by casual readers and those just not in the know. So, you have a show with similar archetypes, themes, and fictional beasts with deep lore. Hell, they even got Sean Bean for its first season, but now quote-unquote upgraded for more adult audiences with sex and violence. An area that the Lord of the Rings movies, as well as the books, don't delve into that much in terms of specifics, and thus an ample place to set up its rival throne, I guess you can say. And so this was an increase in popularity for 6 seasons. And then after that, the decline started. And by Game of Thrones' 8th season became one of the most infamous endings in television history. Tolkien's spot as the media king for medieval fantasy not only seemed secure from further challenge, but further reinforced. But at what point did people realize this though? I would say it was Season 8's Night Battle of Winterfell against the White Walkers. The comparison to the Two Towers battle of Helm's Deep was pretty blatant. Civilians holed up inside a fort against an evil that was not human, or barely human at least, and having 2 Aragorn archetypes this time leading the charge against them as well. And not only that, you even had a Witch King type character as the antagonist, the Night King. However, the battle, for all intents and purposes, made little sense. The cavalry charged into the dead of night with fire swords? I couldn't even see anything. And while there were thrilling moments here and there, they were overshadowed by the show's attempt to do the now dreaded subverting expectations. With Jon Snow, the main Aragorn archetype, who had been set up as the main rival to the Night King, and to have a destined climatic battle with said character literally ignored, and instead having the big bad off by his little sister, Arya Stark. Now, just as a disclaimer, I like Arya and thought her arc was one of the best in the show and, in my opinion, survived the infamy of Season 8. Everything she did more or less made sense to me. But her sudden kill of the Night King literally came out of nowhere, and just like that, one of the main storylines of the entire series ended with a what the fuck, and it was all downhill from there. So, how do I know then that this further cemented Lord of the Rings' place as the king of high fantasy of media? Well, I went on YouTube to compare the battle with that of the second movie's climatic battle at the Hornburg, and lo and behold, on every channel that I watched it on, there was a huge spike in not just viewers, but comments saying that this was how the battle with the White Walkers should have looked. if not better. Clearly, the comparison was not just lost on me. After the fallout over the White Walker finale, it seemed to me like the show tried to go into Lord of the Rings side of the road, you could say, and have more of a morality involved in its portrayals of its characters. And I think this was from the fan base as well. In particular, the increasingly loud gripe that the gritty sexual nature of many of its subplots was now seriously questioned and objected to, especially when it considered sexual violence. This is not an attack on this element in general, but many of them wanted to see more empowered female characters on the show rather than just boob set pieces, as it were. This despite the fact that Martin often said that this was part of the historical inspiration that he drew his writings from, because this was how women unfortunately were treated back in Europe back in the day. It wasn't meant to glorify sex and violence, but to show that this is what the world was. Now, the fans who had cheered that aspect in past seasons as the mature version of Lord of the Rings for adults now seemingly wanted a more Lord of the Rings-like approach to Game of Thrones. Of course, there were other reasons for the show's failures as well, such as going past the books, HBO wanting more seasons, and forcing writers to literally make shit up. But for the point of this video, I think it was a battle with the White Walkers where the real turn from Game of Thrones back to Lord of the Rings really took place. There was a sudden renewed appreciation for not only Peter Jackson's movies, but Tolkien's writings as well. Hence how we saw new books come out since then, even though Tolkien's been dead for a few decades now. Now, one thing I think many fans of both franchises failed to understand was that the themes of both series was always very different. Tolkien was writing his stories as a fictional retelling of English history, and even though it later became less about the real world, it was still rooted in myth and legend and how they were going in decline into the Third Age. And it was also approached from a more moralistic perspective. While historical elements were taken, obviously, and inspired in the stories, it was never meant to be a direct allegory or detailed historical document, as it were, to answer George's question about Aragorn's tax policies. Whereas George R.R. Martin drew the inspiration for his stories more from historical facts and historical events that actually occurred, and it included the grotesqueries of how people actually behave. Therefore, while Tolkien didn't exactly shy away from violence, he never went into exact detail of how someone was tortured or how someone was assaulted. George R.R. Martin did. And it was this difference that many fans saw and why at first they kind of were drawn to Game of Thrones. But since then, it has become questionable. And this questionality, I guess you can call it, has continued to this day, as we have seen with Amazon Prime's Lord of the Rings project, Rings of Power. In that, when it was announced that producers wanted their own Game of Thrones-like series, and that there may even be sexual acts shown on screen within this universe, many fans went from cautious optimism to outright rioting, saying they did not want Tolkien's works to become like Martin's. I think because many perceived the former as pretty much classier. Lord of the Rings was Lord of the Rings, and Game of Thrones was Game of Thrones. Stay in your lane. But regardless of how Rings of Power, as well as its Game of Thrones spin-off series House of the Dragon performed, the two franchises were always going to be compared to each other. But for me, I can honestly say that thanks to the Night Battle of Winterfell and the disaster that was Season 8, that anything of Tolkien's work is currently set as the reigning king of high fantasy in literature and media. It is the GOAT of any kind of portrayal of any kind of medieval fantasy, and the one that anyone else has to either equal to or, if possible, somehow top. Good luck with the last one. And until something else comes along that is equally as legendary from an equally legendary source, or that hits a cultural nerve as the movies that were inspired by Tolkien did, everyone else is going to have to toe the line. But having said all that, what are your guys' thoughts? Did you compare Game of Thrones with Lord of the Rings when it first came out? Did you think it was better, perhaps, or maybe even equal to Tolkien's work? Or did you think it was just another failed copy of what Tolkien did so well so many decades ago? Let me know in the comments below, but otherwise, this is the Miller Philosopher, and you guys have a good day.